Rachel stood frozen as the door creaked open. She had expected Christian to come for her, to try and bring her back into the fold, but what was standing there, framed in the doorway, was not Christian. It was Walter Carson's right-hand man, Tommy. Tommy had always been a shadow in the background, a figure who lurked in the corners of fellowship gatherings, his eyes cold and calculating. Rachel, Tommy's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something she couldn't place. "You've gone too far." Rachel's heart raced. She had suspected that the Carson family would try to stop her, but she wasn't ready for this. Tommy wasn't a man of words. He was a man of action. And those actions? They were never kind. "I'm not afraid of you," Rachel found herself saying, though her voice trembled. Tommy smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "You should be." Before Rachel could react, Tommy lunged, grabbing her by the arm with a vice-like grip. His fingers dug into her skin, and she struggled against him, but his strength was overpowering. He dragged her through the hallways, past the empty rooms where the fellowship once gathered, where the air had always felt so thick with tension. Rachel tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She had never felt so powerless, so helpless. Tommy shoved Rachel into a small, windowless room at the back of the church. It was dark, musty, and smelled like stale incense. The walls were covered with strange symbols, some she recognized from the fellowship rituals, others she couldn't quite make out. "Sit down," Tommy commanded, his voice hard. "You've been digging in places you don't belong." Rachel sank to her knees, her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. She could feel it in her bones. The fellowship wasn't just a group of misguided believers, they were a cult, and Rachel had uncovered their darkest secrets. But as Tommy paced the room, Rachel's thoughts turned to the rest of Dunbridge. The town that had been held captive by Walter and Christian Carson. The town that was just as much a victim of their manipulation as the followers. After Rachel's disappearance, the rest of the town slowly began to wake up to the truth. People started to question everything, the strange ceremonies, the locked doors, the whispers in the dark. The more they talked, the more they realized that the fellowship was not what they had been led to believe. It wasn't just about religion. It was about control, power, and manipulation. At first, the townspeople were hesitant. They had grown up with Walter Carson's influence. He was the man they turned to in times of trouble, the one they trusted. How could they have been so blind? It wasn't until a local journalist, Ben Hargrove, began investigating the fellowship that the first cracks started to show. Ben had been suspicious of the Carsons for years but had never had the courage to speak out. Now, with Rachel gone, he knew he had to act. Ben began digging, talking to former members of the fellowship, gathering evidence, and piecing together the horrifying truth. The fellowship was not a peaceful religious group, it was a cult, and Rachel had been one of its most recent victims. She wasn't the first to disappear, and she wouldn't be the last if someone didn't do something about it. As Ben's investigation progressed, he started to uncover more and more details about the Carson family's dark practices. The rituals were worse than Rachel had ever imagined. They weren't just about spiritual purification, they were about breaking the mind, stripping away the individual's identity, and replacing it with the fellowship's twisted version of truth. But uncovering the truth wasn't enough. For the people of Dunbridge, breaking free from the Carson family's grip was going to take more than just knowledge. It was going to take courage. It was going to take the strength to look at the people they had trusted for years and face the ugly reality of what had been happening right under their noses. The first step was to get the word out. Ben published his findings in the local paper, and soon, others began to speak up. Former members of the fellowship came forward, sharing their stories of manipulation and mind control. People who had been close to the Carson family revealed the depths of their deceit. They weren't just controlling the minds of the townspeople, they were manipulating their emotions, their thoughts, and their very identities. One by one, the townspeople began to confront the truth. They started to question the Carson family's influence and the rituals that had once seemed so sacred. But it wasn't easy. The mental scars left by the fellowship's teachings ran deep. Many of the former members struggled to break free from the twisted beliefs that had been instilled in them over the years. Sarah, a young woman who had once been a devout follower of the fellowship, struggled more than most. She had grown up in the fellowship, believing every word Walter Carson spoke. She had participated in the rituals, even gone through the purification herself. When she first realized the truth, it was like her whole world shattered. "I didn't know who I was anymore," Sarah confessed to Ben. "I had been so sure, so convinced that what we were doing was right. But now I don't even know what to believe." It took months for Sarah and others like her to start undoing the damage the fellowship had done. They went through therapy, support groups, and slowly, they began to rebuild their lives. But the scars would never fully heal. The fellowship's teachings had been so deeply embedded in their minds that it took time, years even, to unlearn everything. But it wasn't just the followers who were affected. The entire town of Dunbridge had been caught in the Carson family's web of lies. The community was divided, torn between those who had been manipulated by Walter and Christian and those who wanted to reclaim their town. Meanwhile, Walter and Christian Carson were not sitting idly by. They were trying everything they could to maintain their control. They had hidden their wealth, their influence, and their darkest secrets. But as the town began to unravel the truth, their grip started to slip. Christian, once so calm and collected, began to unravel. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and his father, Walter, was growing desperate. The fellowship was falling apart, and with it, the empire they had built. Christian made a final attempt to retain control. He ordered the remaining followers to gather for a cleansing ceremony, a ritual to mark the end of the fellowship's reign. But this time, no one came. The followers had seen through the lies, and they weren't afraid anymore. The town of Dunbridge was finally becoming free. Months passed, and the town is still struggling to recover. The scars remained. The community had been shattered, its trust broken. People who had once been friends were now strangers, and those who had been manipulated struggled to find their footing again. Rachel, meanwhile, had disappeared without a trace after being locked away by Tommy. But the seeds of doubt and fear had been planted. She was out there, somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. But that was a story for another day. The Carson family's empire came crumbling gradually, but their legacy of pain would linger for years to come. As the town tried to rebuild, Rachel watched from the shadows, waiting for the day when she could finally confront the men who had tried to control her, and bring them to justice once and for all. Her life had always been filled with uncertainty. But as she sat in the dimly lit room, her thoughts racing, she realized the truth. She could no longer remain a pawn in Christian's game. She had been groomed by him, handpicked to become one of the fellowship's leaders, a role that came with the promise of power, respect, and loyalty. But what had been promised to her as a community, a sense of belonging, had turned into a nightmare. Her heart pounded in her chest as she remembered the twisted rituals, the empty smiles of the fellowship members, the way Christian's words had once made her feel like she was part of something greater than herself. She had once believed in him, in his vision, in the fellowship's cause. But now, those beliefs felt hollow. The power Christian held over the followers was a lie, one built on manipulation, fear, and cruelty. Rachel's instincts had been screaming at her for weeks, but today, she had finally made up her mind. She would escape, and she would bring the Carson family down. It started small, whispers in the night. Rachel began leaking information to a select few people she knew could be trusted. She didn't want to take them down alone. The stakes were too high. She needed to expose the Carson family for what they truly were. Her first ally came in the form of Marissa, a woman who had been part of the fellowship for years but had grown disillusioned after Christian's increasing demands and the strange, ritualistic behavior that began to creep into the daily life of the group. Rachel and Marissa met in secret, in a corner of the church that no one ever paid attention to. Marissa had been one of the first to question the fellowship's methods, and when Rachel reached out, she knew they were both at a crossroads. "I can't believe I let it go on for so long," Marissa said, her voice trembling. "The lies, the secrecy, the way he controlled all of us, especially you." Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder, looking Marissa in the eyes. "We need to expose them, Marissa. We need to show everyone what the Carson family has been hiding for years." They began to strategize, carefully selecting former followers who had been hurt by the fellowship and town residents who had witnessed the strange behaviors of the Carson family. One by one, they gathered evidence, testimonies, and documents that had been hidden away in the depths of the Carson family's fortress. They were determined to bring the cult's dark secrets into the light. Christian Carson had always been the charismatic leader, the figurehead that had convinced the fellowship that they were on a mission of righteousness. But now, with Rachel turning against him and a small but determined group working behind the scenes to expose his lies, the cracks in his empire began to show. Christian had built his life around control, and the thought of losing it terrified him. He had always been able to convince others to follow him, to believe in his cause, but Rachel, she had been different. She had once been his most loyal follower, the one who had shared his vision of bringing the fellowship to new heights. But now, she had become his greatest threat. It was in a small office in the back of the fellowship's church that Rachel finally confronted him. The air between them was thick with tension as Christian stood behind his desk, his hands clenched into fists. "Rachel, you've made a mistake," Christian said, his voice low and controlled, though there was an edge of panic in his eyes. "You owe everything to this family. The fellowship gave you everything. I gave you everything." Rachel stood tall, her eyes burning with defiance. "No, Christian. You took everything. You twisted the truth, manipulated people, and made them believe in something that was never real. It's over." For a moment, there was silence. Christian's gaze faltered, his mind racing. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You have no idea what you're up against." Rachel's eyes locked onto his, her voice steady and calm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This isn't just about me anymore, Christian. It's about everyone you've hurt, everyone you've controlled. It's over." Christian lunged toward her, his hands reaching out to grab her, but Rachel was faster. She had prepared for this moment. She had been planning her escape, and now she was ready to see it through. With a swift motion, she grabbed the stack of evidence from the desk and turned, rushing out of the room. Christian's voice followed her, filled with fury, but Rachel didn't look back. She knew that the final battle was just beginning. Rachel's plan had been set in motion. The evidence she had collected, combined with the testimonies of former members, created an undeniable case against the Carson family. The town began to wake up to the truth, and the power of the Carson family started to wane. But it wasn't an easy process. Rachel had to be careful. The Carson family had eyes everywhere, and they weren't going down without a fight. Walter Carson, the patriarch of the family, had hidden his financial dealings for years, using his position as a leader in the town to shield himself from suspicion. But the walls were closing in. Ben Hargrove, the journalist who had been working alongside Rachel, began to publish a series of exposés about the Carson family's activities. He dug into their finances, their rituals, and their ties to powerful individuals in the community. Slowly but surely, the truth began to seep out, like water breaking through a dam. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, more people began to come forward, testifying about the manipulation, the threats, and the control that the Carson family had wielded over them. Some had been followers for years, while others had just recently left the fellowship. But they all shared one thing in common. Their lives had been destroyed by the Carson family's lies. The day of the trial arrived, and Rachel stood in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment she had fought for, the moment when the Carson family would finally face justice. Walter Carson and Christian Carson sat in the defendant's chair, their faces hard, their eyes cold and calculating. But for the first time, they looked vulnerable. The power they had once held was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The prosecution presented the evidence, documents, testimonies, recordings, everything Rachel and her allies had worked so hard to gather. The courtroom was silent as the truth unfolded, piece by piece. The Carson family's empire had been built on lies, manipulation, and fear, and now it was falling apart in front of their eyes. Walter Carson was found guilty of multiple financial crimes, including embezzlement and money laundering. Christian Carson was exposed for his role in the cult's sinister activities, including manipulating followers and using them for his own gain. Both men were sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. As Rachel left the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and disbelief. The battle had been long, and the road to justice had been filled with obstacles. But in the end, it had been worth it. The town of Dunbridge would never be the same. The scars of the Carson family's influence would linger for years, but the healing process had begun. People began to rebuild their lives, free from the grip of the cult that had once held them captive. For Rachel, the journey had been one of self-discovery. She had gone from being an outsider, groomed by the Carson family to take control, to becoming the person who brought them down. Her strength and determination had proven that even those who are underestimated have the power to change the course of history. The story of Rachel Mason and the Carson family serves as a powerful reminder. No matter how powerful or invincible someone may seem, the truth has a way of coming to light. And in the end, justice always prevails.